My friend and I decided to escape the chaos of popular trails and find a more secluded spot to camp. I'd heard about this old trail that was supposedly closed off some time ago. It didn't show up on any of the tourist maps, so I thought it'd be the perfect place to find some peace. As we started walking, the trail really did feel different. There was almost no sign of maintenance, and we found some ribbons tied to trees, like someone was trying to block the path. Instead of turning us away, this no-entry vibe just made us more curious. We laughed it off, joking that it was probably just to scare off the less adventurous. As we moved on, I started to notice a strange silence. There were no birds, no animal sounds, just the wind and our footsteps. That was when I started to feel something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the feeling of being watched started creeping in. I didn't want to freak out my friend, so I kept it to myself, but I noticed he wasn't as chatty as usual either. The sun was beginning to set, and the trail became harder to see. The trees were getting denser, and the ground was covered in dry leaves that crunched with every step. And then, we heard something. At first, we thought it was just a small animal rustling around, but soon, we realized it was more than that. It was the sound of footsteps. Footsteps that didn't match ours, but also didn't drift too far away. Every time we stopped to listen, they'd stop too. It was like whatever, or whoever, was out there was keeping its distance, observing us. I exchanged a look with my friend, and he looked as uneasy as I felt. The thought of being followed was creepy as hell, but we tried convincing ourselves it was nothing. We kept moving, but the fear was creeping in, and there was no hiding it. Nightfall came fast, and the flashlight we brought barely lit up a few feet ahead. With less visibility, the sound of footsteps got even sharper. By now, our hearts were pounding, and each little rustle of leaves set us on edge. The trail itself seemed to be changing, leading us somewhere unfamiliar. And then, through the trees, we saw something unexpected. A small cabin. It looked worn down, but there was something that stopped us in our tracks. A fire, still burning, like someone had just been there. That lit fire froze us on the spot. Whoever had started it had to be close by, and we were standing there completely exposed. We looked around, trying to catch any movement, but the silence was so heavy we could hear our own breathing. I whispered to my friend that we should get out of there immediately, but the trail behind us already looked confusing and poorly marked, almost like we couldn't believe we were lost. At some point, while we were trying to figure out what to do, the sound of footsteps started again, closer this time, as if whoever it was really wanted us to know they were there. We picked up our pace, trying not to break into a full sprint to keep the noise down, but it felt like every step we took was being matched by another just a few feet behind. I was sweating, my flashlight shaking in my hand, lighting up trees that seemed to close in on us. My friend looked at me, and I saw the same terror in his eyes that I felt. We were out there, in the middle of nowhere, and screaming for help would do nothing. No one would know we were on this forgotten trail, and the sense of being completely vulnerable was almost paralyzing. Suddenly, we heard a loud snap to our left, like someone stepping on a branch. We instantly turned in that direction, but all we saw were shadows blending in with the trees. That was when we realized we were being herded into a trap. Without a second thought, we turned and bolted, trying to get back to the car as fast as we could. We were crashing through the dry leaves and tripping over roots, but the footsteps were no longer behind us. They were all around us. I knew I couldn't stop, but the feeling of someone being so close that we could almost hear their breathing made us want to turn around. Finally, we spotted the start of the trail, where we'd left the car. The relief lasted only a second because when we got close, we saw something that chilled us to the bone. Handprints on the car hood, as if someone had been leaning there, watching the trail. I looked at my friend, and without saying a word, we both knew we weren't alone. Whoever was out there had gotten there first, knew we'd come out that way. And then, the footsteps stopped, like our stalker was satisfied just leading us here. Standing there, staring at those handprints on the hood, we were frozen. We didn't know if we should get in the car, or just run off in any other direction. The silence around us was almost worse than the footsteps, like everything was waiting for us to make the next move. My breathing was all over the place, and every second felt like it stretched on forever. We decided, without even speaking, to unlock the doors and get into the car as quickly as possible. We locked the doors right away, but even inside, the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I turned the key with shaking hands, and in that final moment, my friend whispered, "There's someone out there." He was staring into the dark, but I didn't dare to look. I floored it without looking back, and we drove in silence until we finally hit a busier road. My heart didn't stop racing until we saw the city lights. To this day, I have no idea who or what was following us on that trail, or what would have happened if we'd stayed any longer. Since that day, I've never risked camping in unfamiliar places again. I still have nightmares about the sound of those footsteps, and sometimes I catch myself looking over my shoulder, even in places where I know I should feel safe. It's strange how a simple hike turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys a walk to clear my head after work. You know, just to switch off from tasks and let my mind relax. That day, I left the office more drained than usual, so I decided to hit up the city park. It's a place I knew well, and honestly, I'd never felt uncomfortable there before. I got there around sunset, with the sky still lit up in shades of orange, giving that peaceful vibe I love. I started my usual route, surrounded by the sounds of birds and the wind rustling through the trees. There weren't many people around, but that usually didn't bother me. About 15 minutes in, I started noticing something odd. A guy, maybe in his 40s, was standing a little way ahead, almost like he was waiting for me to pass. He was staring, but not in a way that looked like he was actually looking at me. I felt a bit uneasy, but figured it was just paranoia, so I kept walking. When I passed him, I tried to act like I hadn't noticed him, but I couldn't shake off this weird feeling. I picked up my pace, just wanting to put some distance between us, but then I glanced back, and there he was, following me in the same direction. Every step I took, he seemed to match it. That feeling of someone constantly trailing me just kept growing, and I started to feel a knot in my stomach. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was just headed the same way. But then, I changed directions, and he did too, turning exactly when I did. That's when it hit me. This wasn't in my head. He was really following me, and suddenly my whole body went stiff. The park, which usually felt so calming, now felt oppressive, and the silence around me only made it worse. I started walking faster, already planning to get out of the park and just end that walk right there. But he kept on, following my every move, keeping the same distance the whole time. The creepiest part? He never said a word, didn't try to hide it, nothing. Just that strange, heavy silence, like he was waiting for the right moment to get closer. I even pulled out my phone to call someone, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I sped up again, and sure enough, he did too. At that moment, all I could think about was finding an exit as fast as I could. I was getting closer to a more isolated area of the park, where the trees were denser and the sunlight, which was already fading, barely reached through the branches. That's when I made the mistake of looking back again. He was closer now, and as soon as he noticed I was looking, he partially hid behind a tree, blending into the shadows. The way he moved, sliding into the dark, felt intentional, like he knew he was scaring me and was actually enjoying it. My heart started pounding, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. This didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. That guy was clearly following me. All I could think about was getting out of there as quickly as possible. I decided to run, not looking back, just focusing on the sound of my footsteps and trying to find the shortest path back to an area where there were usually more people. My breathing was all over the place, but I forced myself to ignore it and keep going. At one point, I heard footsteps behind me, quick and heavy, like he was running too. The sound only lasted a second, like he wanted me to hear it, but then it stopped, leaving just an eerie silence behind me. Finally, I got close to an area where I could see a few people up ahead, a group of runners near one of the park's entrances. It felt like an escape route. Seeing them made me feel safer right away, like maybe I'd finally shaken him off. But before I reached them, I glanced back one more time, just to be sure. He was still there, standing among the trees, just staring. But this time, his look had changed. He almost looked disappointed or maybe even frustrated that I'd found a way out. He didn't move, didn't gesture, just stood there, watching from a distance until I reached the group of runners. Even with people around, I couldn't relax. The scariest part was how well he'd hidden himself in the shadows, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I felt like a target, someone being hunted, and that feeling stuck with me in a way I'll never forget. I stayed with the group for a few minutes, pretending to stretch and trying to catch my breath. My whole body was on high alert, but at the same time, I was trying to play it cool, not wanting to seem like I was freaking out. After a while, some people started glancing at me, probably noticing how tense I was, but nobody said anything. I kept telling myself that the guy must have left by now, but out of curiosity, or maybe just fear, I looked back at the spot where he'd been. To my shock, he was still there, half hidden behind a tree, just staring at me like he was waiting for something. That last look was all I needed to make up my mind to leave for good. There was no way I was staying there, trying to act normal. My heart was still racing as I walked out of the park, sticking close to a couple that was also heading out. I tried to keep a steady pace, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing back every few steps, expecting to see him following me again. Luckily, he didn't show up, and when I finally reached the main street, with cars and streetlights breaking up the park silence, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Even so, that feeling of being watched stayed with me the whole way home. When I got home, I locked the door and just stood there for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. It was like the fear was still lingering in me, and I couldn't shake off the image of that man standing in the shadows, watching me. It was terrifying to think that, for a good while, I could have been an easy target out there, and at any moment, he could have done something worse. But what disturbed me the most was not knowing why he was following me, and even stranger, why he just stopped once I'd reached that group of runners. Every movement he made felt so calculated, like it was all just a game to him. Even now, weeks later, anytime I pass by that park, I get chills and an urge to stay as far away from it as possible. I haven't gone back for a walk alone, especially around sunset. This experience showed me just how vulnerable we can be without even realizing it. And to this day, I have no idea what that guy wanted, or if he's ever done this to anyone else. It's just one of those things that happened out of nowhere and disappeared just as suddenly. At the time, I was working on an environmental monitoring project that seemed like the easiest thing in the world. My boss sent me out to a forest near a small town, and all I had to do was set up motion-activated cameras in strategic spots and ensure they were working properly. I spent the first few days alone, installing the equipment and sleeping in a small cabin left by the team. The forest was dense, with this strong, damp smell, but I was already used to environments like that. Honestly, I'd even say I felt at peace, surrounded by just the sounds of nature, far away from everything. On the third night, though, everything changed. It was already dark, and I was getting ready to go to bed, trying to relax after a long day. Out of nowhere, one of the camera monitors started beeping. One of the sensors had detected movement close to the cabin. I thought it might be a curious animal, so I went over to check the footage, pretty much unconcerned. But as soon as I looked at the recording, my heart started racing. The camera showed a figure moving slowly near the cabin, but I couldn't tell exactly what it was. It seemed way too big to be any ordinary animal, and there was something really strange about the way it was moving, like it was circling, almost searching for something. I was completely frozen, just trying to understand what I was seeing. The figure kept moving, but the image was blurry and dark, so I couldn't tell if it was a person or some kind of animal. All I knew was that it was large and had this strange, almost human posture, but it was hunched over, like it was sniffing around the ground near the cabin. The detail that really made my skin crawl was the slow, deliberate way it moved, like it was trying to stay quiet. Every time I blinked, I felt more panicked, wondering if this thing somehow knew I was inside, watching it. The silence outside just made everything worse. I could hear some branches breaking now and then, and to make it even creepier, this incredibly strong smell started to fill the cabin. It wasn't the normal forest smell. It was something heavier and weird, like a mix of wet dirt and some kind of rotting animal. The air felt thick, and the smell only got stronger and stronger. I shut every possible opening, but the smell still seemed to seep in, like it had attached itself to the air around me. At that point, my mind was racing, and all I could think about was staying completely silent and hoping that whatever was out there would leave. Time passed in this strange, stretched out way, and I lost all sense of how long I had been sitting there, frozen. I felt sweat trickling down my face, and the unbearable smell was still thick in the air, like whatever it was had gotten even closer. At some point, the monitor stopped picking up any movement and the camera feed went quiet. But instead of feeling relief, I felt even more uneasy. The silence outside felt even more dangerous. I had no idea if it was really gone, or if it had just slipped out of the camera's range. Every second felt like a battle against the urge to make any noise. I was exhausted, but the fear of making even the slightest sound, of drawing it back, kept me tense. My ears were straining to catch any noise, and every creak of the wood inside the cabin made me jump. I just wanted the sun to rise, for this nightmare of a night to finally end. I sat there in silence, staring into the darkness, hoping that when the first light hit, I would still be safe enough to get out. When daylight finally started creeping in, it was like a wave of relief washed over me, but I still didn't feel safe enough to go outside right away. I waited until the cabin was filled with light before moving. I started packing up the equipment with shaky hands, trying to be as quiet as possible. Every step I took felt cautious, like I was still expecting to see that thing right outside. Even with the daylight, the fear didn't go away completely. It felt like the forest had changed, somehow marked by whatever had been prowling around that night. I took down the cameras as quickly as I could and began the walk back without looking over my shoulder. The path back to the road felt endless. The feeling of being watched never left, and that smell seemed to cling to me, to my equipment, like a lingering reminder of everything I went through that night. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just wanted to put it out of my mind. To this day, I have no idea what that figure was, and maybe I'll never know. The only thing I know for sure is that I never went back to that forest, and that I think twice before taking jobs in such isolated places again. I'm the kind of person who's always loved being outdoors, and recently, with my growing passion for photography, I decided to try something new, capturing the sunrise in a remote area of a national park. I'd done my homework, studied the routes, and picked a spot near a creek that seemed perfect for those early morning shots. The idea of camping alone in the forest didn't bother me. It actually sounded like a great way to unplug for a bit. I arrived there late in the afternoon, set up my tent, organized my gear, and got ready for the night. It was getting dark when I noticed some strange movement among the trees, quite a few meters away. It was just a shadow at first, and I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but oddly, it looked like a person. Without thinking too much, I grabbed my flashlight to get a better look, but whatever it was had already vanished. I just stood there, with the sound of the creek in the background, holding my flashlight and feeling my heart racing. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired from the trip. Still, just to be safe, I glanced around and went back into my tent. The silence that night was unsettling. It was like everything was just holding back, almost muffled. I lay down, listening to the water mixed with the rustling leaves, convincing myself that was all I'd hear that night. But around midnight, I heard something else, footsteps. They were soft but distinct, like someone was moving around my tent. I froze, barely breathing, trying to figure out what was happening outside. The steps were slow and spaced out, like whoever was out there was stopping to check things out every few seconds. The thought of yelling or stepping outside didn't even cross my mind. I just wanted it to go away, for it to be some weird trick my mind was playing, but the sounds were too real to ignore. I tried to grab my phone to light up the tent from the inside and maybe scare off whatever was out there, but my hands were shaking so bad I could hardly unlock it. After a few minutes, the steps stopped and everything went back to that eerie silence, the kind that hurts your ears. I thought it was over, but I couldn't sleep a wink. I lay there, every muscle tense, listening for any hint of sound. When the sun finally started to rise, I stepped out of the tent, feeling exhausted and still on edge. I felt exposed out there, but I needed to get moving. That's when I saw them. Right beside my tent, fresh tracks in the mud. They weren't from hiking boots like mine. They were barefoot, with every toe and arch visible, like someone had walked around my campsite all night. My stomach dropped. There was no question in my mind that I hadn't been alone in that forest. My instincts told me to pack up and get out of there as fast as I could. The thought of staying one more minute in that place was unbearable. I tried convincing myself it could have been some other campers messing around, but the idea of someone walking barefoot in the middle of the forest just didn't add up. While I packed up the tent, I was on high alert, my ears tuned in to every sound, and my eyes darting around, half expecting to see something or someone. The forest felt different that morning, like everything had shifted overnight, and I was the only one there who didn't belong. Once I had everything packed up, I decided not to take the original trail I'd planned. Instead, I took an alternate path, something less obvious, to get back to the main area where I'd started. My mind was racing, and every twig snap or leaf rustle sent a jolt of fear through me. Twice, I glanced back, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. It was like the whole forest was weighing down on me, like every tree and shadow was hiding something, or someone, tracking my every move. The hike back felt endless, each step heavier than the last. A few times, I almost stopped to look around, but fear kept pushing me forward. On a muddy incline, I slipped, nearly falling, and that's when I saw them again, bare footprints. This time, they weren't around my campsite. They were on the trail I was following, like the person had been walking just ahead of me or, worse, waiting somewhere up ahead. My heart pounded so loud, I was sure it could be heard from miles away. I sped up, trying to keep my focus on getting to the exit, but the thought of someone being one step ahead or following close behind was eating at me. I hadn't seen a single person the entire way, and I'd been hiking for a good while, so the idea of running into another hiker out here, barefoot, with no backpack, was impossible. For a second, I thought about pulling out my phone to call for help, but the lack of signal reminded me of just how alone I really was. Out there, it was just me and this unseen presence, something lurking just enough to keep me on edge. When I finally spotted the area where I'd parked my car, relief washed over me so intensely I almost dropped my backpack. But as I got closer, something made my stomach sink all over again. On the windshield, there was a handprint, smeared in mud. The fingers were spread wide, like someone had pressed down hard against the glass. It was fresh, and it was definitely from a human hand. I scanned the surroundings, looking for any sign of who might have done this, but the place was empty. The forest just stood there, silent, almost as if it was watching me too, keeping whatever had happened hidden. I tried wiping the handprint with my sleeve, but it wouldn't come off easily, like it had stained the glass somehow. I jumped into the car, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine, my heart still racing like I was in some kind of nightmare. As I pulled out, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the road, watching me leave. But the road was empty, and the silence of the forest seemed to follow me, a strange, heavy quietness that wouldn't let go even as I drove away. Even now, that whole experience sits with me, and I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Those footprints, that handprint, it's all burned into my mind. I don't have a logical explanation, but there's this eerie sense that whatever was out there knew I was coming and wanted me to know it was watching. I haven't gone back to that forest since, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. Just knowing that someone, or something, was there with me is enough to keep me far, far away. Since that night, I can't camp alone anymore. Something in me changed, like a switch flipped, and now, even the thought of being out there, isolated, brings back that overwhelming feeling of dread. I used to laugh at stories about people being watched in the woods, thinking they were just tall tales. But now I know that feeling firsthand, and it's a fear I wouldn't wish on anyone.